Previously on Solving for the Undefined. We want it to be academically enriching, so the cognitive demand needs to be present within these problems. We don't want to have them plug and chug and try to do 100 problems. We want them to truly think about and use their brain power to solve a problem. And with that, let's get started. Welcome to Solving for the Undefined Podcast. I'm your host, Johanna, founder of Miss Kuiper's Classroom, the place that equips teachers in creating a healthy math classroom where students can thrive, no matter their academic abilities. But it's not always about the numbers, and that's why I'm here, bringing you the formulas to solve your problems, math and otherwise, plus strategies on cultivating that necessary math mindset. And that's what you can count on. Hello, welcome to episode 41. Today's topic is all about cognitive demand. And to start us off, I have a story for you. A man found a cocoon of a butterfly. One day, a small opening appeared. He sat and watched the butterfly for several hours as it struggled to force its body through that little hole. Then it seemed to stop making any progress. It appeared as if it had gotten as far as it could and it could go no further. So the man decided to help the butterfly. He took a pair of scissors and snipped off the remaining bit of the cocoon. The butterfly then emerged easily, but it had a swollen body and small shriveled wings. The man continued to watch the butterfly because he expected that, at any moment, the wings would enlarge and expand to be able to support the body, which would contract in time. Neither happened. In fact, the butterfly spent the rest of its life crawling around with a swollen body and shriveled wings. It was never able to fly. What the man, in his kindness and haste, did not understand was that the restrictive cocoon and the struggle required for the butterfly to emerge from the tiny opening were life's way of preparing the butterfly. The struggle would force fluid from the body of the butterfly into the wings, making it ready for flight. Sometimes struggles are exactly what is needed in life. Remember, nature needs no help and no interference. Struggles are part of the journey and an important part of the learning and growing process. This story was called The Butterfly Story, author unknown. I want you to take a minute and think about, how does this story relate to the classroom? I know for me, I can identify with the man in the story. Him taking a pair of scissors and cutting off the remaining of the cocoon. We so often as teachers want to help our students and we end up over helping. We might see a student who has just one more problem, or if they could just understand this piece, everything would fall into place. And instead of walking them through it, we just give them the answer. I know for me, this past school year, we were doing the Pythagorean theorem, and my sixth period was one of the hardest classes I ever had to work with behaviorally, and I had no energy to actually work through and help them figure out the Pythagorean theorem, so instead, I told them the formula, showed them how to use it, and gave them a worksheet to do. And because of that, these students saw instant success. They were able to plug and chug and find the missing hypotenuse or the missing leg. But in that success, they had no true understanding of what the Pythagorean theorem is. And it being one of my favorite concepts, it has so many ties to other things later down the road, so many different connections that they may not understand because I chose to just give them the formula and have them plug and chug. In that situation I just shared with you, I took away what's called the cognitive demand. So cognitive demand, according to Christopher Klein, is the mental state a person experiences when they are so deeply engaged with a task that they use all of their mental resources and don't notice time passing. When I read that definition, the first thing that pops out to me is they don't notice time is passing. So I was trying to connect that to, when are the times that I don't feel time passing? That usually happens when I'm either reading a really good book or watching a really interesting TV show. Those are the times where just time flies by and I don't realize how much has passed. And looking at those two scenarios, usually the story is captivating. It's related to me. I identify with it. I'm engaged in the ending. I want to know what happens. And that's how we can make it engaging for our students. So we want to know what interests them and put it into our math class. Maybe my students are really into Among Us characters. How can I take that video game and relate it to math or ingrain it into an activity we are doing? The second thing I notice from this is they're using all of their mental resources. When I gave my 6th period class the formula for the Pythagorean theorem without any background knowledge, I was not allowing them to deeply engage with it and use all of their mental resources. I mean, how hard is it to take numbers, plug it into a formula, and then use a calculator to solve for the missing variable? It's not hard. So how can we know for a fact that a task is going to help students use all of their mental resources? There is a cognitive demand analysis kind of scale that we can use. Number 1 is memorization. This is the lowest cognitive demand. This usually involves either reproducing previous learned facts, rules, formulas, or definitions and just committing them to memory. The next level up would be procedures without connections. So this would be the algorithms, or if something calls for a specific procedure. There is no explicit connection necessarily to the concept. So this might have been that worksheet I gave to my students that had Pythagorean theorem problems. They were doing a procedure without actually connecting it to what Pythagorean theorem was. The third level of this scale is procedures with connections. So usually this involves multiple representations of something to help make that connection between those multiple representations. So like linear equation is a graph, situation, table, equation, all of those different things. And in this level of the scale, it requires some degree of effort. So general procedures or formulas may be followed, but they can't be done mindlessly. And then the fourth and final level is actually doing mathematics. So this is where it requires complex and non-algorithmic thinking. So using an approach that's not explicitly suggested. Like, here's a Pythagorean theorem worksheet. Guess what you're going to use? Oh, hey, the Pythagorean theorem. But it requires students to explore and understand the nature of the mathematical concepts, processes, or relationships, and it helps them access some relevant knowledge and make appropriate use of it. With this scale, there is a time and place for all of them. I'm not saying you have to make sure that all of the problems you do in your classroom are a level 4. That would be a lot. Think about if you're using your total mental capacity, that's hard and that's draining for us as adults. So imagine how that could be for kids. So it's okay to have some level 2 and 1 types of problems, but you want to make sure the focus is those 3 and 4 cognitive demand problems. I'm interrupting today's episode to ask you a vital question. Do you have the tools in your classroom for student success? Well, wonder no more, because I have a way for you to check your work. My new guide, 7 Math Teacher Must-Haves for Student Success, has the top 7 items you need in your classroom. From classroom staples to manipulatives that are often missed, this checklist will ensure that your students have a successful school year. Additionally, each item shows the best budget and splurge options. Download your guide after listening to today's episode by going to misskuypersclassroom.com/must-haves. Now that we have a better understanding of what cognitive demand is and the scale of it, we're going to talk about 2 more things. 1, how can we take a problem and make it a higher level of cognitive demand? And 2, how can we scaffold in our classroom without reducing the cognitive demand or taking it away? So let's talk about the first one. How can we make something have a higher cognitive demand? One thing I like to do is take out the middle or take out the ending, meaning making something an open middle or open-ended problem. An example might be thinking about solving equations. X's value is 3. What could the equation have been? This is allowing students to think more deeply and broadly about the subject without having to do like what you do one side, you do the other. They're using that within the X has to be 3. What could the equation have been in order to lead us there? Another way to boost cognitive demand is asking students to explain, prove, or justify their thinking. An example of this might be, prove that the transformation that occurred on this graph is a reflection. And then students would have to think about, well, how can you know it's a reflection? What are the properties? Blah, blah, blah. So you're kind of getting the idea of making it bigger or more than just what's 10 plus 10, because that has a finite answer. You want it to be bigger and broader than that. And if you listen to those last 2 problems I gave, those were not word problems. I think a lot of teachers tend to think that if it's a story problem or a word problem, it's automatically going to have a higher cognitive demand. And while that's true a lot of the times, it's not always true. And then moving into how can we scaffold in our classroom and still have the cognitive demand level be present. I know a lot of us have students working below grade level, or we have ELLs in our classroom, and we want to make sure that we make it accessible for everyone. One of my favorite scaffolding tools is calculators. Yes, calculators can be scaffolding. A lot of times if students come to us below grade level, they might not have that foundational fact fluency. And while we want to make sure that we are embedding that within our lessons, sometimes giving them a calculator will help them complete tasks that are higher level, but not take away the cognitive demand of it. Another scaffold you can use is called a 3 reads protocol. And if you use the Ready Math curriculum, you might know this one. When you are faced with a problem, whether it's a word problem or something else, you're going to read it 3 times. And each time you're going to answer a different question. So the first time you read it, you're going to say, what is the problem about? And students can discuss it and come up with some things. What do they notice about this problem? And the second time they read it, then what is the goal of this problem? And finally, after the third read, what information is important for us to achieve that goal? All of these questions guide student thinking. They're truly understanding the problem as they read through it. And if there's any questions about what it is, those come up during this 3-read process. If you're in the midst of a problem and students seem to be struggling, some things you can ask to scaffold are, tell me what you know about blank. So whatever the problem is or the concept is, tell me what you know about it. Or another question is, can you walk me through your process? Or how did you find this answer? Those things will help students go back to the beginning and kind of walk you step by step. And I've seen a lot of times when I do this with students, they'll kind of catch themselves and like, oh, that doesn't make sense. Or it prompts me to give them another question. So I gave this example in another episode, but I had students working on volume of a swimming pool and like how long would it take to fill the swimming pool? And they came up with 17 minutes. And we talked about it. Does that make sense? Can we fill a swimming pool in 17 minutes? No. So they had to go back and check their work and work through the process again. I scaffolded it without actually giving them an answer. One last thing before I wrap up today's episode, we want to be careful not to accidentally take away cognitive demand. Maybe we've done this really awesome problem and we know that it's going to be really good for students. And then we see that students are struggling to start the problem. And you want to pause the class and be like, class, look up here. This is how you're going to start the problem. That is giving away the punchline. You don't want to do that. Instead, you might be pause the class. What do you notice about the problem? What are some ideas that we could use? And that would not be taking away the cognitive demand, as would giving them what to start with is. So keep that in mind as you take this idea and move forward into this week. So in wrapping up, we want to make sure that the problems we are using within our classroom allow students to deeply engage, use all of their mental resources, and they don't notice time passing. And with that, we want to make sure that the questions we are using, not all of them, but most of them, have procedures with connections and require students to actually do complex, non-algorithmic thinking. We can up the cognitive demand by putting it as an open-ended or open-middle question, or asking students to prove, explain, or justify. We can still scaffold without taking away the cognitive demand by having students read through what is the goal, what do we notice, what information is important, using guided questions like, tell me what you know about, or walk me through your process. How did you come to this conclusion? And we want to make sure not to take away cognitive demand by giving away the punchline. And with that, I'll calculator. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. To find all the links and resources to things talked about in this episode, head on over to MissKuipersClassroom.com and click on podcast.